Hi everyone, this is Jewish history class at Flagler College. Our discussion today turns to the state of Israel from its independence until the early 1980s. I'm breaking the discussion of the modern state of Israel into two video lectures because there's a lot of information. And frankly, we could spend an entire semester course easily talking about this. Such a course is offered at many places. There's a lot of information that I'm leaving out here, but I've tried to cover the essential details, and hopefully it will be clear enough. And if you have questions, again, feel free to post those on discussion board. So Israel declared independence in May 1948, and when we last talked about Israel, which I believe was a couple of weeks ago, we mentioned that after the Second World War, there were, of course, a lot of Jewish refugees fleeing Europe. Britain had kind of cracked down on Jewish refugees entering Palestine. This was part and parcel of its 1939 White Paper, which pulled back on its commitment to the establishment of a Jewish state there. And of course, this was done, partly because the British had made a lot of guarantees to the Arabs and to the protection of the Palestinian groups. And a lot of that got put on hiatus during the Second World War. But after the war, Britain, tried to prevent Jewish refugees from making it to Israel, or making it to Palestine, I should say. And in the meantime, the Jews, the Yeshuv, as the Jewish community was called in Palestine, was preparing to defend itself against attacks that were about to come from the various Arab countries in the area, who had all declared an intent of making sure that the Jewish state was never established, and that the Palestine would remain in Arab hands. And all of this done against the background of the UN vote to partition Palestine and to create, on the one hand, a Jewish state on the north and west, and down into the Negev, and a Palestinian state which would encompass Jerusalem, Jericho, Nablus, and down into the Gaza Strip. And this is, only the most recent of all partition plans. I should say, with Jerusalem under the UN plan, that was to be an international city under the direct governance of the United Nations. This and a number of other things were not palatable either to the Yeshuv, or to the Palestinians, or to the surrounding Arab countries. And so when the British troops left, Israel declared independence. And several Arab countries, Jordan, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, and even some support from other countries, they launched a massive military invasion of Palestine to try to prevent, the Jewish state from forming. And this is known in Israeli circles, of course, as the Israeli War of Independence. The Palestinians would call this something very different, obviously. But despite facing long odds, the Israeli army was incredibly successful. And here we're not going to go into the military aspects of this. Suffice it to say that they ended up seizing a fair amount of territory, most especially. And so you have Tel Aviv and Jaffa here on the coast. There is a road that runs from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Well, this was the main kind of avenue of approach. The Israeli army pushed back against the Palestinians, and even seized the western part of the city of Jerusalem, as well as all of the Negev. Jordan, realizing the Palestinian cause was doomed without direct intervention — I mean, they had been part of the attack anyway — they went ahead and, with their military, occupied the hill country here in the eastern part of Palestine. This would eventually become known as the West Bank. And Egypt, in a similar situation, decided to occupy militarily this little region of land down here, which comes to be known as the Gaza Strip. Okay, so this is the political reality after the Armistice Agreement in early 1949, in March 1949. Israel agreed to give some of that territory up, but they did retain their foothold into West Jerusalem. Jordan now controlled the eastern part of Jerusalem, including the old city, which is the part of the city that was, that had the old Temple Mount on it, now occupied, and since the 7th century by the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. But this included the Western Wall, or the Wailing Wall, as it's called, right? So all of that is controlled by Jordan, as well as the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and some sacred Christian sites. And the Palestinians, for the most part, many of them, I should say, thousands, tens of thousands of them were displaced as a result of this war. And they were offered sort of refugee status or sanctuary in the surrounding countries, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Jordan, in Egypt. And so thousands of Palestinians moved out of Palestine. But these countries did not integrate them. They promised them that they would regain their territory very quickly, that this would only be a temporary thing. And so they set up refugee camps close to the borders with what had been Palestine, what was now at least partly Israel. And the Palestinians lived in many cases, abject poverty, right? Over time, these refugee camps would become more than just camps. They would become whole cities occupied by Palestinians. I've been in Jordan, for instance, and driven by what used to be the Palestinian refugee camp, which is now just a neighborhood inhabited mostly by Palestinians. And, we are... this was about 11 years ago or so, but that was 60 years post Israeli War of Independence, and these people still considered themselves Palestinians, still felt that they would return to Palestine and reclaim their homeland, and all of that, right? So these refugee camps become, from this point on, hotbeds for dissent and for attacks into Israel, for acts of terrorism, I guess is one way to put it, or liberation, I guess, from another perspective, right? So, thousands and thousands of Palestinian refugees now living in the borderlands of Palestine, Israel, but in other countries. And not fully integrated into those other countries. So this is obviously going to be a problem. Israel holds its first elections while the war was still kind of going on. January 1949, they established a parliament, which is called the Knesset. David Ben-Gurion, who was pictured here during the kind of victory celebrations of the War of Independence. This is Ben-Gurion right here. He is elected as prime minister. Chaim Weizmann, who had been, we talked about him, he was the chemist who was a good friend of Arthur James Balfour and probably the kind of the operative force behind the Balfour Declaration. He had been a president of the World Zionist Organization. He was elected as president. If you don't know, the prime minister is the operative head of government. He's the one who heads up the parliament. Israel has a parliamentary system similar to the democracies in most European countries, and the prime minister is usually the head of the party who has the most seats in the Knesset. Of late, meaning the last few decades, there have had to be these coalition governments, and the seat of the prime minister is often, the source of a great deal of contention and negotiation. I am speaking on a day when, coincidentally, Benny Gantz and Bibi Netanyahu have apparently, I just saw the headlines for this today, reached an agreement to form a coalition government, and Netanyahu, I guess, is stepping down as prime minister, which is a position he's held for more than a decade at this point. And he is going to be part of the coalition government, but Benny Gantz is going to be the prime minister, I think. I hope this information's not wrong, because this is going on YouTube, and this will be associated with my name forevermore. But that seems to be what's happening, and I suppose that could still break down. But that whole system is still fully in operation. So the Israeli government takes its shape, and right after the War of Independence, there is mass immigration into Israel. Now, with the British having withdrawn, their military efforts to stem the tide, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Jews pour in, initially from Europe, but over the subsequent few years, the largest influx of Jews were coming from other Middle Eastern countries. Let's remember that there had been, under the Ottoman Empire, millions of Jews living all over the Middle East. Baghdad in the early part of the 20th century probably had a Jewish population of something around 100,000, which is the remnant of what was left from the great days of Jewish Baghdad, right? So with the now fierce animosity formed between Israel and the Arab countries of the Middle East, Jews no longer felt safe in those countries, and many of them, eventually most of them, make their way to Israel and set up their lives there. And so, then this is an interesting, and we could say troubling consequence for the demographics of Israel. That even though going forward the Ashkenazic population continues to hold the majority of the political power, the so-called Mizrahim, these Middle Eastern Jews who never had really been part of European Jewish culture, were, if not a majority, a significant part of the population. Yet they, for the most part, were shut out of the halls of power. And that demographic has been an aspect of Israel that's often not talked about a great deal, but Jews of many different cultures, have tried to come together, and sometimes have been at odds with one another. There have, subsequently been a large influx of African Jews, the Falashas and others, into Israel, and these are Jews from Ethiopia and from other parts of Africa, and there's been an effort, sometimes with greater intent and greater friendliness than at other times, to incorporate even these African Jews and Chinese Jews and lots of people who claim Judaism as their religion into the state of Israel. That process begins really in the late 1940s. From this time forward in these refugee camps, with the support of Jordan and Egypt and Syria and others, the Palestinians formed these groups called Fedayeen, gangs of guerrilla fighters who periodically staged attacks into Israel, hitting targets of various kinds, carrying out acts of terrorism. And even more, to add to that, the Arab countries tried to starve Israel into submission. They tried to cut them off from any sort of international contact. Egypt, for instance, closed the Suez Canal and blocked access to some of Israel's port cities with their navy. They tried in any number of ways to make Israel's life difficult, and this continued to sort of grow the hostility between the two. And we also, and so that's part of the background for some of the events that follow in the 50s and 60s and 70s. Another key aspect of this whole story is the Cold War. Um, Israel-Palestine becomes a key theater for the proxy wars fought between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Now, if you don't know what I mean by proxy war, the Cold War is just that. It's cold. The U.S. and the Soviet Union never erupted into open hostilities. They were not firing shots or, worse yet, nuclear missiles at each other, though there was a lot of posturing in that regard in the Cuban Missile Crisis and other times. But they tended to support different countries and different rebel groups in different parts of the world, right? Vietnam and Korea are the two most famous cases of this. There were proxy wars fought all over Latin America, all over Cuba. The Cuban establishment of communism in Cuba in the late 1950s is part of this system of proxy wars. Well, one of the key theaters in the proxy war phenomenon was Israel-Palestine. And not just Palestine, but Israel and all of the surrounding Arab countries. And the most important figure on the Arab side in this proxy war was the Egyptian president Gamal Abdel Nasser. And if you've taken African history from me, this name will be familiar to you. He's, I think, one of the more important political figures of the whole 20th century. Nasser was the chief proponent in the 50s and 60s of pan-Arabism. That is the political philosophy that all Arabs should join together under a single banner. Islam was a part of this, but this was also at least partly a secular kind of political philosophy, meaning they didn't want to turn power over to the Islamic clerics, and maybe the establishment of Sharia law would be okay, at least in part, but this was to be a political process rather than a religious unification. Nasser pushed very hard for this, for all Arabs to join together, and in his quest to establish this pan-Arab alliance, Israel was the chief boogeyman. Israel was the symbol that Nasser used to unite all Arabs. And this is part and parcel of the Cold War, because Nasser rejected NATO, rejected the United States and its allies, and for reasons that are not surprising. Egypt had been largely under the thumb of the British from the early 1880s until the early 1950s, when Nasser, then as a military officer, had overthrown the king of Egypt in a coup d'etat. And 4 years later, now as a retired military officer and a civilian, won elections as Egypt's president. This was a wholesale rejection of Great Britain. And so not surprisingly, he made an alliance with the Soviet Union. The Soviets helped to fund the Egyptian army and navy and air force. They sent them military equipment, things like fighter jets and of course Kalashnikov rifles and the military hardware from the Soviet Union. And on the other side, Israel was turning more and more to the United States for help, and the U.S. and its allies were sending military equipment to the Israelis. This proxy war erupted into a sort of full-scale war several times, and we'll trace some of those. The first of these is in 1956. Now, this is a complicated thing. This is called the Suez Crisis. In October 1956, Nasser had nationalized the Suez Canal. Now, what that meant was the Egyptian government had taken over running the Suez Canal entirely. That was a big deal, because the Egyptian government could now charge whoever whatever price to pass through the Suez Canal. And given that I should say that Britain was still very reliant on its Commonwealth, on trade with places like India. Sorry, the Freudian slip there. I said India before I said Britain. This was of huge concern to the British. The British were still in control of places like Kenya, and what they called Rhodesia, what later became called Zambia and Zimbabwe, as well as, they still had, up until 1961, a foothold in South Africa. It was still part of the Commonwealth, and of course Australia and India and these other places. And so the British were still heavily involved in this, and the Suez was absolutely necessary. Full access to the Suez Canal was absolutely necessary for the kind of the functioning of their entire economy. When Nasser nationalized it, the British really got scared, and they together with the French, who were also very reliant on the Suez because they still controlled what was called French Indochina and other colonial territories. They convinced Israel in a kind of secret agreement to invade Egypt, to attack Egypt. Israel captured so this began in late October 1956. Israel captured the Sinai Peninsula, but then Britain and France, this is a pre-arrangement, they then sent their militaries into the Sinai on the pretext of separating the Egyptians and the Israelis. But then, this sort of the story broke about what this was all about the secret agreement, and international condemnation came down hard on the British and the French, and to some extent on the Israelis for doing this. The UN did make Israel some guarantees in exchange for giving up the the Sinai Peninsula. Made them guarantees that they would establish a kind of buffer zone right on the Israel-Egypt border that would protect Israel. However, the UN at this point did not have a great deal of clout, and even though they sent a peacekeeping force there, it was almost entirely impotent to do anything about Egyptian attacks or Fedayeen attacks from Egypt into southern Israel. So that's the first kind of hot crisis here, right? Now, between 1956 and 1967, Israel did not fight any open wars with any of its neighbors. There's still a great deal of hostility, animosity. The surrounding countries expressed a desire to destroy Israel, to kick all the Jews out, and to reestablish Palestine in control of the entire country, right? But this didn't break out into any extended military engagements. And during this decade, Israel made a number of sort of strategic decisions that put them in a stronger position. One of these was to enter into an alliance with West Germany. Now, if you don't know much about the Cold War, after the Second World War, due to the military expediencies on the ground. At the end of the war, Germany was split into two parts, West and East Germany, and West Germany was democratized and firmly allied with the United States, and Britain and France became part of NATO. East Germany was an ally of the Soviet Union as part of the Warsaw Pact. So West Germany made a sort of a series of diplomatic overtures to Israel in an effort to reconcile and even to some extent to atone for the Holocaust. And this culminated in symbolic gestures like Willy Brandt, making public apologies. He was the German chancellor in the late 60s and early 70s. Making public apologies to all of the Jews of the world, and specifically to Israel. And so there was a lot of efforts on the part of the Germans to try to, help out the Jews and especially help out Israel. And so from the late 1950s on, the West German companies invested in Israel. West Germany sent financial and other support, paid war reparations, or I should say Holocaust reparations, to Israel. And this was controversial on both sides. There were many in Israel, in fact, who thought that David Ben-Gurion had sold out by normalizing relations with Germany. They didn't want any sort of reconciliation. On the other hand, there were still forces in Germany who thought that this showed German weakness. But this went forward, and this was a great boon to Israel financially and economically. In addition, we've talked about this a couple times already, so I don't want to belabor the point, but Israeli Secret Service agents arrested, or rather captured, Adolf Eichmann in 1960, and managed to transport him to Israel. He went on trial in Jerusalem and was hanged for crimes against humanity. The picture here on the bottom left is of Eichmann surrounded by Israeli military guard, and this is when he was receiving his sentence at the trial. And this, was an international cause célèbre kind of. It was an international news story that captured everyone's attention, and to some extent lent strength and support to Israel as the revelations more and more about what happened in the Holocaust came to light. This helped people feel that Israel had a right to exist, and strengthen their international support, especially in the United States, and in particular among American Jews, who became more committed to Israel as a result of the revelations of the Eichmann trial. From this point on, as I said in the last lecture, American Jews even start talking about the Holocaust, and it becomes part of their fundamental identity. Now, the hostilities which had been building between 1956 and 1967 erupted in June of 67 in what was called the Six-Day War. It was obvious that Egypt, Jordan, and Syria were massing forces on the border, that they were arming the Palestinian refugees, that what was about to commence was a full-scale invasion of Israel. And so instead of waiting for the attack, Israel did a preemptive strike on June 5th, 1967. With its air force, it destroyed the Egyptian Air Force. Like every plane, they were all on the ground, so it wasn't difficult, I suppose. I've never flown a fighter jet, so I don't know how difficult it was. But they were sitting targets in any case. They destroyed the entire Egyptian Air Force, which had been provided, the planes which had been provided by the Soviet Union. They, then staged a ground invasion of the Sinai Peninsula. Jordan decided to attack and Jordan still held the territory west of the Jordan River, including East Jerusalem. And so they attacked from there, and Israel drove them back. In fact, they drove them all the way back across the Jordan River. Syria had participated in shelling and bombing from the north, and specifically the region in southwest Syria called the Julan or Golan Heights. So Israel also invaded into the Golan Heights and seized all of that territory. After 6 days, Israel was in possession of everything you see here on the map in the upper left part of the pictures here. Everything you see in various shades of green and yellow, right? So the whole of the Sinai Peninsula all the way to the Suez Canal, the Gaza Strip, this whole territory here to the Jordan River, which was now called the West Bank, meaning the West Bank of the Jordan River, and the Golan Heights up here to the northeast of the Sea of Galilee. Here we have Israeli soldiers celebrating, or rather paying homage at the western wall of the Temple Mount, the Wailing Wall, because now Israel was firmly in control of its most sacred sites, or rather the most sacred sites, I should say, in the Jewish religion. This was a great moment of triumph for Israel. But on the other hand, this now created a number of problems. And those problems have never gone away fully. We are now almost 63 years past, 53 years, 53 years, I can't do my math, I'm a historian, give me a break, okay. 53 years past the Six-Day War, and Israel still is to some extent in possession of all of these territories. Not the Sinai, which they give up later, but the Gaza Strip still more or less under Israeli administration, even if it's been turned over to the Palestinian Authority there. The West Bank is still firmly under Israeli control, and the Golan Heights is as well. And the population of Palestinians living in these territories remain under the auspices of Israeli government without being given full citizenship and full rights. Okay, so the problem of the occupied territories is from 1967 on going to bedevil Israel, right? And be the source of all sorts of problems. And really the main bone of contention between Israel and the Palestinians, between Israel and other Arab countries, even with the normalization of some relations there, there's still a great deal of animosity. And this has never been rectified. And frankly, I don't know that that Israel and Palestine have ever been further away from a solution to this than they are today, even in the aftermath of the Six-Day War. We could almost say that subsequent Israeli history, at least in a kind of geopolitical sense, is largely concerned with the status of the occupied territories. And I think that almost everything could be read through that lens. With Egypt and Jordan and Syria, who had been the defenders of Israel and the ones primarily waging the war for the liberation of Palestine, now utterly defeated by the Israelis, the Palestinians begin to take measures into their own hands. There had already been a number of bodies formed claiming to represent the Palestinian interests. Foremost among these was a group called Fatah, but Fatah alone, who was headed by a fellow named Yasser Arafat. But Fatah alone did not have sufficient support, and so Fatah entered into a kind of agreement with a number of other groups who also claimed to represent Palestinian interests. And this umbrella organization was known as the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or the PLO, right? And given that Arafat was in control of Fatah, he became the foremost leader of the PLO from the late 1960s on. Now that the position of Jordan and Egypt was compromised, and Syria for that matter, the kind of headquarters or the base of operations moved to southern Lebanon. And Lebanon itself was a mess from 1975 to 1990. Lebanon was in its own civil war, which was connected in no small way to what was going on in Israel-Palestine, and I'll talk about that, at least some chapters in that saga in a few minutes here. But from this base in Lebanon, the PLO, which had an avowed policy of destroying the state of Israel and establishing Palestine as a unified country, and of driving the Jews from Israel, right? So they made no bones about what they were planning to do or what they wanted to do, right? So the destruction of the state of Israel and the establishment of a homeland for Palestinian Arabs, this is their no compromise position at this point. And so they staged a number of guerrilla raids into Israel all through the 1970s into the 1980s. So that process that had begun with the forming of the Fedayeen continued. But in addition to that, the PLO began to choose other symbolic targets to make a statement internationally, right? So over the course of the 70s and early 80s, the PLO was involved in a number of, for instance, a number of hijackings of commercial airlines that had Israeli passengers on them. There was a case in, when was it? The mid-1970s. I'm not sure the exact year. 76, I think, when they hijacked an Air France flight that had 100 or so Israeli passengers on it. I think it was headed for Jerusalem or Tel Aviv. But I guess it would have been Tel Aviv. That's the main airport. Anyway, and they hijacked this plane and diverted it to Uganda, to an airport in a city called Entebbe, and an Israeli commando unit under the leadership of Yonatan Netanyahu is who is the brother the of Benjamin or Bibi Netanyahu, the now outgoing prime minister of Israel. Um, anyway, he led a commando raid that managed to free the hostages and fly them to Israel. He was killed in the raid and became a national hero, and this is one of the things that association has definitely lent itself very well to the political career of Benjamin Netanyahu, although he has a number of other credentials, right? He didn't ride the coattails of his famous brother entirely. But I mean, that family, is held in great respect in Israel, partly because of the deeds of Yonatan. Most famously, though, the PLO carried out an attack in Munich during the Olympic Games in 1972, where 6 Israeli athletes and a German police officer in the Olympic Village were gunned down by a PLO operative or a number of PLO operatives, and Israel subsequently managed to track down all the perpetrators and kill them. This is what the film Munich, the Steven Spielberg film from, gosh, when was that made? 2004 or something like that, is about. That's a really fantastic film, I think. That's another one I would highly recommend to you if you still are thinking about doing a an extra credit film, or if you're just interested in the subject, you should watch Munich if you haven't seen it. It's very, very good. It really gets at the heart of a lot of these issues that we're talking about today. And so the PLO, became a kind of international scandal due to these high-profile terrorist attacks and hijackings and other things. Really, when I was growing up, the PLO was, by American, according to the American understanding, the very devil. I mean, when I would see pictures of Yasser Arafat as a child growing up, I would get scared. I mean, when I thought of terrorists, Yasser Arafat is the one who came to mind. That's just how the PLO was perceived in the United States. Of course, in the Middle East, the PLO was perceived as a liberation organization fighting desperately to give nationhood to these beleaguered people, the Palestinians. So, I mean, perspectives obviously matter here a great deal. And I could comment on, terrorism in this period more generally, and bring in other groups like the African National Congress and others, and comment on that whole thing. But I think I'll refrain from doing that instead. Okay. Suffice it to say that perspective really matters here. In the meantime, Egypt and Syria, Jordan had not withdrawn themselves entirely, but they were hesitant to get involved directly in any specific military campaign against Israel at this point, having lost so severely during the Six-Day War. But Egypt and Syria began to mobilize again, and the Israeli government was aware of this, but maybe didn't make adequate preparation. Certainly they were criticized in the aftermath for this. Golda Meir, who was the first female prime minister of Israel, had been elected after the retirement of, Ben Gurion was long gone by this point, but she was the latest Labor Party leader. The Labor Party had never relinquished control up to this point of the Knesset, but she was elected as the prime minister. She was in charge. Golda Meir has a very interesting backstory, by the way. We don't necessarily need to get into, but look her up. She's a kind of fascinating figure. Born in Michigan, I believe, and immigrated to Israel. Anyway, Egypt and Syria chose the day of Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar. This was October 1973, to launch an attack into Israel. And this was simultaneous on the north and on the Sinai Peninsula, which Israel still held. They pushed well into Israeli-held territory, and the Soviet Union lent a great deal of support, reconnaissance, and even airlifted supplies to help out with the supply chain of Egypt and Syria. The U.S. responded by launching its own airlift to support the Israeli military. Many soldiers had to be tracked down in synagogues where they were participating in services during Yom Kippur, but Israel managed to rebuff the initial advance, and then to advance themselves, they re-seized the entire Sinai and went about 25 miles into Egypt before the U.S. and the Soviet Union brokered a ceasefire between the two. This is another thing that Golda Meir was criticized for, was actually agreeing to the ceasefire. It was, thought by some in Israel that they should advance even further and remove. Well, it was, by this point it was Anwar Sadat from power, and take control. I don't know what they were hoping for. Actually, that would have caused all sorts of problems. But the ceasefire was brokered, and Israel had survived another round, so to speak. And it's this, it didn't come immediately, but this did seem to, this had a number of effects. For one, there was a great deal of internal dissent. Okay, the Labor government, which had been in power since 1949, was seen by some as corrupt, as decadent, as insufficiently vigilant in protecting Israel's interests. The fact that the public had not been notified about the potential threats coming from Egypt and Syria was the greatest point of criticism here. And, despite this, what ultimately was a fairly smashing victory, there was a lot of discontent with the Labor government. And this led ultimately to their defeat in the 1977 election and the rise of the Likud party, which I'll talk about in just a minute here. But this also, and it wasn't necessarily as a result of the Yom Kippur War, but Israel's continued hold on all of these territories began to spark international outrage, that they were not willing to sort of broker some sort of deal to hand this territory back. Occasional television footage of Israeli soldiers confronting Palestinian youths, having, with the Palestinians throwing rocks at these machine gun wielding soldiers, began to influence international opinion. And in 1975, the UN General Assembly, not the Security Council, because the U.S. And others probably would have, almost certainly would have blocked this from becoming an official resolution, but the UN Assembly passed a resolution, no teeth at all, but passed it anyway, declaring that Zionism was a form of racism, and this largely driven by countries from the Middle East and others who were critics of Israel, as well as by the Soviet Union. And so Israel really took a hit in the mid-1970s, both internally and externally. In 1977, the Likud party, which was a political party outgrowth of the revisionists, which were founded by Vladimir Jabotinsky, as we've talked about. They swept to power, gained a majority of seats in the Knesset. An old leader of the Irgun, their paramilitary organization, Menachem Begin, became the new Israeli prime minister. He gained that position largely on his reputation for being a tough guy, for being a no-compromising, proponent of military strength, and Likud was in charge. Now, interestingly, despite the continued tensions between Israel and Egypt, despite now a more hardline, right-wing, hawkish political party in control of the Israeli government, Egypt and Israel began to open up peace negotiations. And this was driven in part by the terrible economic situation in Egypt in the late 1970s. This was the period of stagflation, kind of worldwide. There had been an energy crisis, and anyway, the world economy in the late 70s was really suffering, and Egypt, with the loss of the Sinai, and the control of the Suez Canal and all of that really took a hit. And so Sadat was desperate. He's the one who became the Egyptian president after Nasser. He was desperate to normalize relations and to regain the Sinai. And Begin, interestingly, despite being the tough guy candidate, was willing to kind of enter into talks. Sorry for all the noise in the background. I think my kids are having a pillow fight or something. Anyway, hopefully that's not too disturbing here. Anyway, Sadat actually visited Israel in late 1977 and expressed willingness to enter into peace talks. A key figure in this was the U.S. President Jimmy Carter, so he agreed to, or he offered, I should say, to host peace talks at Camp David, the presidential retreat. And Sadat and Begin worked out a deal. And in 1978, they signed, in the presence of Jimmy Carter, these Camp David Accords, where Israel agreed to hand over the entire Sinai, and Egypt agreed to recognize the existence of the State of Israel and to normalize all diplomatic and economic relations between the two countries. Now, from a perspective of hindsight, that this happened in and of itself is remarkable. That this peace between Israel and Egypt, its most populous and, arguably most powerful neighbor, that it has held now for more than 40 years, despite Egypt being governed for most of that period by a rather brutal dictator, Hosni Mubarak, is almost miraculous. Okay. But the Camp David Accords are one of the great, I think, success stories in the history of Israel and the history of Egypt, for that matter. Things took a darker turn in the following years, not between Israel and Egypt, but in other respects. In 1981, Anwar Sadat was assassinated by a Muslim fanatic in retaliation for his normalization of peace or of diplomatic relations with Israel. Hosni Mubarak then came to power, and he, again, I think miraculously or remarkably continued these normalized relations with Israel. In 1982, though, a very dark chapter in Israel's history occurred, and that was the invasion of Lebanon. Lebanon had been, from the late 1960s on, the staging point for Palestinian operations. The refugee camps were where the Palestinian operatives trained, where they got their missions, where they went out and performed these terrorist acts, things like hijackings, where they staged a lot of guerrilla raids into northern Israel. And so Begin, again, he still had a kind of military first governing policy. Begin, and together with, and maybe driven in large part by his defense minister, Ariel Sharon, who will come back up in a later chapter here, or I should say a little bit later in our discussion, made the decision to invade Lebanon and to seize control of these refugee camps and to drive the Palestinians from these hotbeds of guerrilla activity. They were successful at doing this. They established a security zone in southern Lebanon. But Sharon, and here, here's where the debate starts. Did Begin order this? Did Sharon act on his own sort of his own volition? What was driving this? Sharon made the decision to allow the Israeli Defense Force to continue to press into Lebanon all the way to Beirut, where there were more Palestinian refugee camps. And so they had cleared the ones in the border, but he went all the way to Beirut, and there were some refugee camps in kind of suburban Beirut that they attacked. They seized control of these, and now, the thing about Lebanon is, you have to have some knowledge to really understand why all of this happened the way it did. of Lebanon itself. Okay, so Lebanon had been created from a French colony or a French sphere of influence. I forget which it was, but and there had been a kind of brokered peace treaty back in the middle part of the 20th century. I forget exactly which year, 1940s, something like that. Anyway, where there was a power sharing agreement between the large Christian population of Lebanon, which at the time of its independence had been the slight majority in population. They had agreed to share power with the Sunni Muslims and the Shiite Muslims, and this minority Egyptian or minority Muslim group called the Druze, who also had a fair share of the population there. And so this whole power sharing arrangement had been put into place. But in the meantime, the Christians in Lebanon had their birth rates had declined, and they were no longer the majority of the population, but they still held power there. They were worried about the growing population of Muslims, especially with the massive influx of Palestinian Muslims. And so, they had, or rather, groups from among the Christians, paramilitary groups, had worked together with the Israeli Defense Force. And kind of in the chaos of this, and again, it's uncertain exactly how this all came about, but it seems that Sharon ordered these Lebanese Christian military groups called the main one called the Phalanges to clear the refugee camps called Sabra and Shantila. And instead of clearing them by forcing the people out peacefully, they carried out massacres in these two refugee camps. As many as 3,500 people were killed. The Israeli Defense Force, who was in control of the camps, did nothing and may have even aided in not in like killing people necessarily, but there were reports the Israeli Defense Force soldiers fired flares at night so that the Phalanges could have light to continue the massacres. And this, of course, when news of this broke, it was an international scandal, and much of this came down on the head of Israel. The PLO fled. Not all the Palestinians did, but the leadership of the PLO fled Lebanon, ended up in Tunisia, and so Israel did accomplish what they wanted to there, but at great cost to their reputation. And this scandal largely brought down Menachem Begin. He was a broken man after all of this, and his wife died shortly after this. And when that happened, he resigned from his office as prime minister. And one of the key results of the Lebanon War of 1982 was not the formation, but the growing strength of a number of militant groups, one of whose chief goals was the destruction of Israel. And the main one of these is Hezbollah, which was a Shiite group organized by Iran in Lebanon. Why Iran, you ask? Well, Iran, of course, was a Shiite country, and Iran had only recently had their revolution, 1979, and so they were eager to sort of spread the influence of Shiite Islam, and so they helped to form Hezbollah, and Hezbollah sort of took the place of the Palestinians in staging guerrilla raids into Israel and doing other things to destabilize the situation. So I'm going to close this lecture with that very dark chapter in the history of Israel-Palestine, and we'll pick up with the events of the 1980s, the rest of the 1980s in the next lecture. Thank you.